Shadow Business Secretary Jonathan Reynolds. Thank you very much for being with us this morning. Firstly, I just want to look at reports in the newspapers this morning that Labour's looking at changing the voting system to allow settled migrants, so people who may be citizens of other countries but live, work, pay taxes in the UK, and also 16 and 17-year-olds to have the vote. What's the plan?
Well, good morning. Look, some of the speculation that's been in the press about Labour policy actually relates to our policy-making process. It's not our manifesto, it's not a statement of party policy, but it's how we go about doing that. We've got a process where people put in their submissions, they're deliberated on, they're voted upon. So this is not a statement of policy yet, but of course we're always looking at ways to strengthen our democracy, to involve as many people in possible as that, and there'll be an element of that, the reform of how this country operates, how power is shared in the Labour manifesto, that's for sure.
Do you personally think it would be a good idea to allow settled migrants and 16 and 17-year-olds to have the vote then?
Well, I think there are arguments for expanding the franchise. It's not an area I directly deal with in the Shadow Cabinet, so I'm not going to give a definitive answer on that. But I think we should always be seeking to involve as many people as possible in our democracy. That's what strengthens democratic politics. That's what we need to see encouraged, and I think we haven't seen enough of that in recent times. So it's something we will look at. But some of the reports, as I've got to stress, they're not the final plans for the Labour manifesto. This is about the process by which we achieve that manifesto.
I mean, it could be a pretty big expansion of the franchise if it was to be a Labour policy, one that could also potentially make it easier for Labour to win an election.
I don't think any changes to how the British state works, how democracy works, should be ever considered through any kind of party political lens. It should be about what is right for the country, what is the right way to make politics work better, and that would be the only criteria we would put forward. But it certainly wouldn't be any consideration of partisan advantage.
Of course, never. Thank you for giving us a bit of a steer, I guess, on the policy at least. Now, Keir Starmer says his Labour Party will have to be clause 4 on steroids. So that, of course, is the moment when Tony Blair rewrote the Labour constitution to ditch its commitment to nationalisation. I mean, that's pretty big talk. So what is it specifically that you want to do?
Well, Keir is laying out the scale of the challenge. And as we saw in the local elections when it got to polling day, the big questions for people in this country are they better off after 13 years of Conservative government? Do they think any public services work better after those 13 years? And the scale of the challenge, therefore, for Labour, it's not just turning around an economy that hasn't functioned very well for 13 years, it's the complete reform and delivery on public services in a way where the scale of that, I don't think has ever been greater. And specifically for me, on the economic side of the Shadow Cabinet, that's bringing in the kind of modern industrial strategy we see in other countries. We see many parts of our economy, the automotive sector is a good example we're stressing today, where you need the state to be active, a partner, to draw in the kind of private investment that we're seeing in the US through things like the Inflation Reduction Act. But we haven't had a response here to that in the UK. And, you know, the fact that the UK has the lowest business investment in the G7, with all the good things, all the strength and innovation that we have in the UK, these are major problems, and Keir is laying out the scale of the challenge and his ambition and our ambition to meet that challenge.
It feels to me, I guess, that Labour are very good at laying out the scale of the challenge, but what we haven't heard so much of are like specific policy ideas. I mean, you can point to radical Blair policies, the minimum wage, for example. In his speech, Starmer even compares his government to the Labour government in 1945 when the National Health Service was first set up. And I haven't really heard much on that scale from this current Labour team, despite the rhetoric. Is it that you don't have the ideas, or you just don't want to tell us right now what they are?
No, I think our job is to articulate those and get them across. So what I'm talking about specifically here, I would say look at our pledge to reform business rates, a fundamental change of the business rate system, to change the apprenticeship levy, to let firms spend up to half of their apprenticeship levy funds on other forms of training. I would look at our promised changes to the planning system, to have an industrial strategy to begin with, to put in significant public investment through our Green Prosperity Fund, to leverage in the kind of private investment we need to see, and to make Brexit work. So if you specific policies on rejoining the Horizon Science Programme, on agreeing a veterinary agreement with the EU, on having the mutual recognition of professional qualifications. I'd say these are all detailed things. Now, what we saw in those local elections was clearly the Conservative Party rejected and people choosing Labour over the Conservatives, but we know we've got more to do. None of us are complacent. We've got to get that message across of the scale of our ambition, of the hope we want to deliver back to the country, and why these specific policies that we've got deserve a hearing, and that they are the answers to the problems. So, look, we know we've got more to do, but I don't accept the case that we're not putting forward specific policies, because I actually think, compared to many oppositions, a year, 18 months before a general election, we've got far more on the table than most political parties usually have at this stage.
I'm not saying that you're not putting forward specific policies. I'm just talking about the scale of it. When you're looking at the rhetoric from Keir Starmer, it's going to be clause 4 on steroids. We're going to talk about the 1945 Labour win. You know, they're talking about policies like the NHS, like the minimum wage. You know, you mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. That's $369 billion worth of policy. And one of the policies you mentioned is allowing firms to spend half the apprenticeship levy on other things. I'm just talking about the scale of what you're putting forward.
Well, I actually think the aggregate scale of what we're putting forward, a very different approach to the economy, a very different approach to public services, is worthy of that. And actually, many times you mentioned those previous governments, people at the times would have said this isn't ambitious enough, this isn't significant enough. It's only in retrospect you really get the sense of scale on that. But just to look at what we're putting forward in my area, in business and industrial strategy, this is a very significant change. It's real public money. It's not trying to match, by the way, the scale of the Inflation Reduction Act, because I don't think we can do that as a nation of our size and scale. But it is a very different approach to what we see at the minute, which is a government that has some quite eye-catching industrial targets, but no way to deliver that. We're promising the money that would go in to bring in that private investment, the changes to things like planning and the regulation of the national grid that would facilitate that, changes to the skills system, to business taxation. You add that up, and that is a compelling and comprehensive package. It's not the full picture yet. Of course, there'll be more for the manifesto, but I do think it's the kind of change that we need to turn around living standards and, of course, provide the revenue that gives us the chance to improve public services to the level the British people expect.
We had Grant Shapps on the programme earlier. He said that the mood in the Conservative Party is one of steely determination. How would you class it?
I'm not an objective observer of the Conservative Party, but I think it seems quite demoralised and, as ever, full of internal conflicts and battles. I look at Conservative MPs, and I think, to be honest, many of them are looking perhaps to a post-election period and the succession and who might take over. But look, we can't be distracted by that. We know we've got a mission to do to... we've turned the Labour Party around since 2019 in terms of its perception and the trust the public have in it. We know we've got to go further, win more people over, perhaps do more on the hope and optimism as well as the reassurance and credibility that we've had to re-establish. So whatever the mood in the Conservative Party is, it doesn't detract from the mission that we've got in the Labour Party.
OK, Jonathan Reynolds, thank you very much indeed. Jonathan Reynolds there for the Labour Party.